Ngā mihi tuatahi ki te atua tēnā koe. My first greetings are to God, our Creator. All praise and thanks to the one who has made us all. Kia papatua nuku hora nei ngā mihi. Greetings to our Mother Earth that sustains us in life with fresh air and clean water and abundant food. E ngā mana whenua, ngā iwi o Aotearoa, ngā mihi. I greet the first people of New Zealand whose gift of land and mountains and rivers we all enjoy. E te mininga to the audience, haere mai, nau mai, whakatau mai, a very warm welcome. Ki ngā rangatira, Dr Najib Lafraie and Dr Arif Saeid, tēnā kōrua. Haere mai I runga I te kaupapa ki tēnei maru ahi ahi. Welcome to this unfolding of this evening with all the insights and discoveries it holds for us. Ko Beate Matis toku ingoa. My name is Beate Matis, and it is a pleasure and honor for me to facilitate this webinar on Afghanistan, what happened in Afghanistan. Ka te rana reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. When we hear about Afghanistan in the news, it is usually about fights, about wars, and about humanitarian crises. Yet, Afghanistan is a country with a long history and a rich culture. More than 1,000 years ago, science, art, and architecture were flourishing. One of the early international trading routes, the Silk Road, connecting Asia and Europe, went through today's Afghanistan. It is an honor and pleasure for me to introduce to you Dr. Najib Lafraie. And I'd like to tell a little bit more about Dr. Najib Lafraie. He is originally from Afghanistan and did his university studies in the United States. During the Soviet invasion from Afghanistan, during the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, he joined the liberation movement, serving as the head of the political office of one of the main Mujahideen groups, was appointed as Minister of Information in the government in exile following the Red Army withdrawal. He then served as Minister of State for Foreign Affairs in Kabul from 1992 to 1996. When the Taliban captured Kabul, he and his family went into hiding for a year before they fled to Pakistan. In September 2000, he arrived in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as official quota refugee. Dr. Najib Lafraie served as lecturer and senior lecturer at the Department of Politics, University of Otago, from 2002 to 2015. And after his retirement, he's been since very busy in voluntary work in support of refugees with the Red Cross. He has also been a voluntary Muslim chaplain with the Otago University and Polytech since 2019, and is the producer of the radio program Muslim Chaplaincy Conversation. So at this point, we wanted to show a couple of pictures of Afghanistan, of the shape of Afghanistan and the geography, so that you can capture where Afghanistan is exactly, because then you'd also understand why the Silk Road went through Afghanistan. And if Sahib is ready, then we can ask Dr. Najib Lafraie to start with his presentation, because I'd like to know, Dr. Najib Lafraie, how did Afghanistan, with such an ancient history and culture, become a country that has been invaded several times and has seen so many people suffering and leaving the country?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you. I think answering your question would need a separate session, because tonight the topic was what happened in Afghanistan and what is the situation now. But just briefly, Afghanistan is on the path of, it's because of its strategic location at the heart of Asia, it has been on the path of world conquerors, and from Alexander the Great all the way to Genghis Khan, and then British Empire in 19th century, and then the Soviets towards the end of in 1980s, and the United States in 2000s, they have all got involved in Afghanistan because of its strategic location. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Afghanistan has been at the grip of war and instability for the past 43 years. Ever since the communists launched their coup in April 1978, followed by the Soviet invasion at the Christmas Eve of 1979. The removal of the Taliban government by the US and its allies after the 9/11 terrorist attacks raised the hopes that finally Afghans will be able to enjoy peace and security. So yeah, this slide shows that there was peace and stability in Afghanistan until 1973, when the king was removed by his cousin and brother-in-law Dawood, and he proclaimed a republic, but he earned the wrath of the Soviet because he changed his policies from pro-Soviet to pro-West, and that is why the communist, pro-Moscow communist parties, factions, they united and launched a bloody coup on April 27, 1978. And I consider that as the darkest day of modern Afghanistan, because all our miseries started from that day. And since the communists lost the plot, and they, towards the end of 1979, the Soviet had only two options: either to intervene directly or to let Afghanistan go out of its sphere of influence. So this is why they invaded at the end of 1979, and for 10 years, they tried whatever they could, but they failed. So finally, they accepted their defeat, and it was Brezhnev who launched the invasion, and Gorbachev who ended, and the Mujahideen, the resistance movement, they were not able to remove the Kabul government for another 3 years or so, and finally in 1992, we went into Kabul. So after the US came to Afghanistan, the expectation was that the US forces remove the Taliban government, dismantle Al-Qaeda, and then leave the country. That was hoped to be followed by the arrival of international assistance to support the newly formed Afghan government and to alleviate the general population suffering. Unfortunately, it did not happen that way. The international aid did come, but what trickled down after the donor, contractors, subcontractors, and corrupt officials took the lion's share benefited only a small segment of the society. The miseries of the majority continued, and the socioeconomic inequality reached unprecedented heights. As for the American and NATO troops, they overstayed their welcome, and their numbers kept rising. The mistakes they made, mistakes quote unquote, because many times that could not be considered as a mistake, and the atrocities they committed gave a new lease of life to the Taliban. The Taliban, who seemed almost completely annihilated in 2002, re-emerged as a fighting force and as a liberation movement by 2005-2006. Instead of dealing with the roots of the problem, the American response was to increase the number of troops, reaching 140,000 American and NATO troops in 2011-2012. I wrote an opinion piece for the International Herald Tribune in September 2006, and you can see that on the screen. The title that they chose for my article sums up my views and arguments. The way out is to get out. Imagine the thousands of lives that would have been saved, and the billions of dollars that would have been saved if the withdrawal of the foreign troops had happened 15 years ago. Thus, President Biden's decision to leave Afghanistan was only an acknowledgement of the inevitable. But the way it took place was a disgrace, probably worse than what had happened in Vietnam some 4.5 decades earlier. In this talk, first I'll briefly discuss how the US decision to withdraw from Afghanistan came about, how the withdrawal took place, and what happened at the Kabul airport with civilians' evacuation, how and why the Taliban advanced so rapidly, what the Taliban have been doing since reaching power, and finally, what is the situation now. President Biden's decision to leave Afghanistan was the culmination of a process that had started more than a decade earlier. Some talks between the US and the Taliban took place during President Obama's term, and the Taliban office in Doha, Qatar, was an outcome of those contacts. Until President Trump, though, the Americans had refused the Taliban's main precondition for serious talks, that is, putting the complete withdrawal of foreign troops on the negotiation table. Donald Trump's position was against the war in Afghanistan during the presidential campaign, but ironically, the war intensified in the first years of his presidency, and the same was true for Gorbachev. Why? Because both had given their military commanders an ultimatum to bring the situation under control or be ready for withdrawal. When the situation got worse instead of improving, Donald Trump's Department of State started talks with the Taliban in July 2018, and a month later, Zalmay Khalilzad, and his photo is on the left of the slide. He's an Afghan American, very close to the Republicans. He was appointed as a special representative. 8 rounds of talks led to the signing of what is called Agreement for Bringing Peace to Afghanistan at the end of February 2020. It provided for the withdrawal of foreign troops by May 1st, 2021, the Taliban pledging not to let Afghan territory be used against the US and its allies, exchange of prisoners between the Taliban and the Kabul government, removal of UN sanctions on the Taliban, and finally, intra-Afghan negotiations to decide the future. The agreement also included 2 classified annexes, the contents of which are still not disclosed. Next slide. As we know, Trump had to leave the White House before the agreement was fully implemented. President Biden, who had opposed troop surge in Afghanistan when he was Obama's vice president, took several months to make up his mind as to what to do with the agreement. On April 14, 2 weeks before the troop withdrawal deadline, he announced his decision. Overriding the recommendations of his military advisors, he decided for the withdrawal to start on May 1st and be completed by September 11. And later it was changed to the end of August. No conditionalities attached. And I think this is important, and you can probably ask questions about it. No conditionalities attached. He presented arguments in support of his view, which make a lot of sense. For example, this is a quote from Biden's statement. No one wants to say that we should be in Afghanistan forever, but they insist now is not the right moment to leave. When will it be the right moment to leave? 1 more year, 2 more years, 10 more years? End of quote. The process of the withdrawal of the American troops and its NATO allies, which had begun earlier, picked up speed after Biden's announcement. At least 10 American bases around the country had been closed during 2020. The Kandahar airfield, one of the larger ones, was closed down in mid-May 2021, and the Bagram airfield, the largest, in early July. The manner of vacating the latter was strongly criticized in the media, though. It was reported to have been abandoned, and I quote, by shutting off the electricity and slipping away in the dark of the night without notifying the base's Afghan commander, who discovered the Americans' departure more than 2 hours after they left, end of quote. And there are rumors that the thieves had discovered their withdrawal sooner, so that's how the commander learned. By this time, the Taliban ironically, soon the US brought 5,000 more troops to the Kabul airport to assist with the evacuation of civilian fighters and those Afghans who had held the foreign forces. By this time, the Taliban had entered Kabul and the panic-stricken Afghans rushed to the airport, encouraged by the rumors that the Americans would take away anyone who could get inside the airport. Those rumors were not completely baseless. I know of more than a dozen people who managed to get out without meeting any of the criteria that were set for evacuation. The number may reach thousands. Of course, their rush created problems for the people whose lives were really in danger. We all saw on our TV screens the mayhem and the beatings that took place outside the airport. They were blamed on the Taliban, but according to an eyewitness, it was the way that the Americans, quote unquote, organized, because I'm not sure whether we can use that word. The way that Americans organized the evacuation that contributed to the chaos, and it was the CIA-trained Afghan special forces who had formed a buffer between the Taliban and the foreign troops who did most of the beatings. The Taliban offensive coincided with the withdrawal of foreign troops. At the beginning of May 2021, when they started their offensive, the Taliban controlled 73 out of 421 districts in Afghanistan, and the map on the left shows that. No provincial capital and no major city. In May, they captured 15 districts. In June, 69 more, including some major border crossings. And by the end of July, they had brought 223 districts under their control. Next slide. Despite their previous assurances, they began capturing provincial capitals and major cities in August. And by August 14, they were at the gates of Kabul. President Ashraf Ghani, who was probably more responsible for the failure of the intra-Afghan negotiations than the Taliban, fled the city on August 15. The Taliban, who had said only a few hours earlier that they will not enter the city without an agreement, moved in with the excuse that there was a vacuum of power and they did not want law and order to get out of hand. The Taliban rapid advancement seemed to have taken even the Americans with surprise. How were they able to do it? There are domestic factors, external factors, and unexplained factors. Discussing all of them is beyond the scope of this short talk. I'll just mention them, and you can ask questions if you want to know more, and we'll briefly explain only a few. The domestic factors include: one, the government losing popular support due to rampant corruption, license to immorality, and political infighting of the elite. Two, traditional leadership losing their status also due to corruption and misuse of power. Three, insecurity and law and order problems. Four, poverty, unemployment, and unprecedented inequality. Five, rampant corruption in the ranks of security forces. Six, low morale of most of the security forces. And seven, the Taliban opening up to other ethnic groups. About the last point, it should be noted that during their rise in the second half of the 1990s, the Taliban were popular only among the Pashtuns, one of the major ethnic groups in Afghanistan, in the north and east, and face a lot of problems in western, northern, and central Afghanistan. This time they had opened up more for other ethnic groups, winning supporters among Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras, the other major ethnic groups, Afghan ethnic groups. I hope Viti can show that slide about ethnic groups later. That is why their offensive in May and June this year mainly focused on the north and the west and faced little resistance. As for the external factors, negotiations with the US, participation in peace conferences in Moscow, and trips to various capitals, including Beijing, granted the Taliban a measure of legitimacy. The US-Taliban peace agreement also reduced American military backing, especially air support to the Kabul government. The most important external factor, though, was Pakistani support to the Taliban. It is documented that the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, its military spy agency, played an important role in the creation of the Taliban and their victory in the 1990s. That support continued after the Taliban were removed from power in 2001, and Musharraf especially playing double game with the United States, and the presence of the head of ISI in Kabul soon after its fall to the Taliban was an indication of its role in their victory this time. The above internal and external factors can explain the fall of Kabul, but not so quickly, even before the completion of the withdrawal of foreign troops. Why did the Afghan troops surrender without much fighting at the command of higher ups in Kabul? And there are lower officers who have written that we are ordered, commanded by our higher officers to leave our positions and go to Kabul. What happened to the 30 to 40,000 special forces who were highly trained by Kiwi and other Western forces, were handsomely paid and possessed the latest military gadgets? How was the elite group of special forces trained by the CIA, and then their number reached about 8 to 10,000, able to travel several hundred kilometers from its bases in eastern Afghanistan to Kabul to provide security at the airport during civilians' evacuation? And why they did not fight the Taliban? All these show that there were deals behind the scene, but between whom and for what reason, only time will tell. There are rumors and conspiracy theories, but no concrete evidence yet. Next slide. What have the Taliban been doing since reaching power? Unfortunately, they have been going against the promises they made before their victory and in the first weeks in Kabul. They had announced a general amnesty, and their spokesman in Doha and Kabul used to talk about human rights, women's rights, and an inclusive government. The gentleman on the right, I don't know whether you saw him on Al Jazeera, Abdul Qahar Balkhi. He speaks perfect English, Kiwi dialect or British dialect, I'm not sure. Everyone was so much impressed by such guy, and the other one, Zabiullah Mujahid, on the left. There are some improvements as far as observation of civil liberties is concerned compared to their rule in the 1990s. For example, the Shia religious minority was allowed to hold their special ceremonies. Female doctors, airport police officers, and journalists are allowed to continue working, and some private TVs are still operating, sometimes hosting interviews that severely criticize the Taliban. On the other hand, they have not allowed girls' high schools to reopen in most parts of the country. In Herat, it was open and then closed. I'm not sure, Dr. Saeid will know better whether it's still open or not. University female students cannot attend classes, and the women working in government offices, except for the airport and hospitals, have not been allowed to return. The Taliban announced the government several weeks after capturing Kabul. It was, however, anything but inclusive, and that is what they had promised, anything but inclusive. They were all Taliban members, all men, and the vast majority of them belonged to one ethnic group. Another Taliban deed, which may have long-lasting consequences, was their attack on Panjshir. This is an interesting topic, but we don't have time to go into details. But some of those who had fought against the Taliban in the 1990s, they had taken shelter in that Panjshir valley, which is north of Kabul, about 60, 70 kilometers north of Kabul. And the photos that I have at the bottom, the left is the father, Ahmad Shah Massoud, Afghanistan hero, because he put the stiffest resistance against the Soviets. And he was the only commander that remained inside Afghanistan during Taliban's first term. And he was martyred only 2 days before 9/11 in a suicide attack. And the one on the right is his son, and he was the leader of the group who went to Panjshir. And unfortunately, the Taliban, they just wanted some assurances that Taliban would not repeat their past atrocities. But they faced brutal attack, and they had to flee to the mountains, where they called for a national uprising. If the Taliban continue what they are doing, most probably many other people around the country will say yes to their call and join the uprising. And the last slide, as for the current situation, the Taliban seem to have failed to achieve even the minimum that they had achieved in the 1990s, namely establishing relative security and law and order in the areas under their control. They had been able to do that in 1990s. But this time, we have witnessed not only major and minor terrorist attacks by ISIS and what happened just yesterday in Kabul city, but also a lot of killings, robberies, thefts, and murders in Kabul and elsewhere. Most of these are committed by the criminals, some of whom were released when the Taliban opened the gates of prisons, but some are committed by the Taliban themselves. The Taliban also seem to have resumed their past brutal policies. There are reports of mistreatment of demonstrators and journalists, men being slapped in public for wearing Western-style clothes, people being stopped at checkpoints, searched in a humiliating way, and asked to unlock their smartphones and show their contents. Just yesterday, the Human Rights Watch released a report about 100 summary executions of former government's security forces, despite the Taliban's proclamation of a general amnesty. In political front, there seems to be a rift among the Haqqani group of the Taliban and their Quetta Council. And the photo on the left is Sirajuddin Haqqani, the head of that group, was Minister of Interior, but the strongest person, because his group was the one who captured Kabul and got the lion's share in the government. There's division between the Haqqani and the Quetta Council, both tribal based, because the two belong to two different tribes of the same ethnic groups, and also ideological, because the Haqqanis are much harsher and much more rigid. Among the Kuwait Council, we saw the photo of Mullah Abdul Ghani brother earlier, who was the chief of Taliban negotiating team in Doha. He was expected to become prime minister, but he was sidelined because of his moderate views. As for the economic situation, we have all heard of the warning of the looming humanitarian disaster. The freezing of Afghanistan assets by the US plays some role in this, but the problem is much deeper. And finally, on the diplomatic front, although no country has recognized the Taliban regime so far, some seem to have a very positive attitude towards them. For example, Pakistan, Qatar, China, and lately, United Arab Emirates. Most others are biding their time, while some, including the EU, have offered humanitarian assistance and are opening their diplomatic missions in Kabul. Tajikistan is the only country that has adopted a hostile position towards the Taliban. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Najib Lafraie. Thank you for this overview, very short overview. As said, it's a long history, but you managed to capture the last decades. And these are decades of war and atrocities. And giving this situation of 40 years, more than 40 years of war and atrocities, I think it's not a surprise that many people have left the country. And this leads us to our second guest speaker, Dr. Arif Saeid. Dr. Arif Saeid served as a medical doctor in Afghanistan and also worked for Médecins Sans Frontières from 1994 to 1999. He moved to New Zealand in January 2000, and for 17 years, he worked with the organization Refugees as Survivors New Zealand, where he led the community services team. He works closely with refugee communities in the areas of unemployment, social engagement, and preventing violence, as well as improving health and well-being to advance smoother resettlement. He also supports young people. They are from refugee backgrounds to reach their potentials in education, employment, and social well-being. And yes, he works with the young people also to prevent them from becoming members of gangs and taking drugs, alcohol abuse, and any forms of violence. Dr. Arif Saeid is currently the president of Refugee Council of New Zealand. And the role of this council is to ensure that all aspects of New Zealand's asylum and refugee policy and practice, legal, social, economic, health, and cultural, comply with international law. Dr. Arif Saeid, you have been working with refugees for many years. Thank you for sharing your experience, and especially when it comes to refugees from Afghanistan. Thank you.
Kira, good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Biat, for the introduction. And thank you, Sahib, for organizing the event. Dr. Lafraie has very well presented the past and present history of Afghanistan. Thank you, Dr. Lafraie, for that. What happened in Afghanistan, the one simple example that I can give is like a child is spending hours and hours on the beach building a sand castle and destroying it in a few seconds or minutes. This is exactly what happened in Afghanistan. 20 years of rebuilding Afghanistan, And having such a strong military, police, intelligence force, everything, and as rightly Dr. Lafraie mentioned, for some unknown reasons and who was behind and who did what, just collapsed in matter of weeks, which is very unfortunate. And it's very unfortunate for the people of Afghanistan because the resources, the force, and everything has been vanished rapidly and unexpectedly. Anyway, I have been in Afghanistan during the last time of Taliban when they were in power, and I left Afghanistan when they were in power. And I know what they do and what they did at that time. Although on the surface they say we have changed and they have changed, but they have not changed in reality. We are in contact with people from back home, and we know what they are still doing. They searching house by house and taking people out and killing people, even in front of their house, in front of their families. My part was to talk about the resettlement of Afghans refugees or coming to New Zealand, especially this lot which we call Afghan evacuees. New Zealand government responded to the crisis in Afghanistan and rescued a few hundreds of Afghans. It was around under 400 people which were evacuated from Kabul airport and brought them to Dubai or Doha, and then from there to New Zealand. And there are 1,250. Some of them have come already, and some more will come. Dr. Lafraie mentioned also, unfortunately, when the airport chaos happened in the airport, everybody ran to the airport because it was a free flight to go for a better life. But there are lots of genuine people whose lives are in danger. They are still stuck there and they are hiding. While the people who had no reason, sometimes they also flee. But with this group which New Zealand has rescued from Afghanistan, we have lots of educated people, like we have women judges, women prosecutors, we have doctors, we have all sorts of people whose lives were there in danger there. When they arrived, the first lot arrived, I'm working with the group, with the Afghans. I was appointed from my job, from my pay work, which I'm working with Minister of Social Development, to help the people who are working with this group, and also to understand the culture and the custom of Afghans, and also with the Afghans themselves to answer their questions, and also to help them whatever, if they need anything, and how to find their solutions, temporary solutions, while they are in temporary accommodation. The resettlement of this group is a little bit different than the normal Quito refugees and also than the asylum seekers. Normal Quito refugees, when they arrive, they stay in the Mangere Refugee Resettlement Center for 6 weeks, and there are organizations working with them in terms of mental health, education, immigration, all of them there to take care of the basic assessments for the arrivals. While the people who are in the temporary accommodation, at the moment, they do not have those facilities. They do have access to medical assessment and medical needs. However, the other parts are not met yet. I think partially that could be because of the lockdown, which Auckland is still in level 3 too. At the Mangere Refugee Center, people also get orientation classes for how life in New Zealand is, and also they will be assessed for employment in level of English, and also qualification recognition, all these things, which is not happening at this stage for the evacuees. I have been asked this question many times from generous Kiwis who are willing to help and support. They have a good heart and sympathy for what our people are going through. And mostly what I always see what the needs are for this group, especially one of the immediate need is housing, for example. Immigration New Zealand is trying to find housing for this group. However, if anyone around the country where these groups are going have housing, they can contact New Zealand Immigration, and they will do all the contract and everything, and advance payment and bond and everything will be taken care. But if you know anyone in the area of refugee resettlements, please contact them and tell them if there is. The other needs for this group is the initial household items. Although the government do provide the reestablishment grant, but you know it's not immediately enough for a family of 5-6 people to start from zero. So when we live in a house for 10, 15, or 20 years, we take for granted everything we need. We go here and take it and take it. But when you go in an empty house, there are plenty of things you might need. So if anyone has household items which are not using, will be appreciated if they could support this group. The other point is these are the immediate needs. When they move from the temporary accommodation to permanent accommodation, but when they move to the permanent accommodation, it's always as usual for other refugees. It will be good to just visit them if you're in the neighborhood, or advocate for them. It's very hard for a family. Most of these families are in see at this temporary accommodation day by day. They are so stressed and upset and sad, because when they talk to you about how quick they lost everything in matter of 2-3 weeks, they ended up in the airport and being in Dubai, while they had household of goods which they built for their whole life. And most of these people who are at a high level of possessions, they had good lives there. So and suddenly they end up, the first lot that 400 people came, they only came with just their clothes on, and maybe one small handbag, that's it. But the rest of them, but maybe the second or third lot, because they are coming from Pakistan or Iran or Tajikistan. They're a little bit more equipped, but still you can imagine how many, what can you bring with 20 kg allowance with the airplane. So the other thing is when they move to the community, language important. If you could support with English language, or employment is the main one. Employment is the best outcome for resettlement. If a person finds an employment immediately, after arriving, that is the best port for resettlement, because they will not fall under to go through the welfare dependency, social welfare dependency. So if they have a job immediately, that will be fantastic. In these areas, anyone can help, that will be wonderful and well appreciated. I think we have to leave some time for questions as well.
Thank you, Dr. Arif, and thank you for explaining a little bit more about it. I have already received a few questions, and so for those of you who have now questions to Dr. Najib Lafraie or to Dr. Arif Saeid, please put the questions in the Q&A box of the Zoom. So then we can see them and we'll respond to them. One of the questions that came up was what cities are the refugees going to immediately? But maybe you can also say a few words about how are they selected to come to New Zealand in the first place?
Sure. Probably you have seen in the media, immediately New Zealand reacted to the crisis. Their reaction was for the people who work with New Zealand army or police forces in Afghanistan, because they had police training in Afghanistan. And also with the aid agencies, New Zealand Aid also worked in Afghanistan. INFAT also had some kind of work in Afghanistan. So immediately they provided visa for the people who were in some kind of form involved with the New Zealand agencies working in Afghanistan. Those were the first immediate ones. And after that, the second group was the people whose lives were in danger, but they had proper documentation. For example, they had all the proof of the women, female judges, female prosecutors, or medical doctors who had link here, and they had approved all those documents that their lives were in danger. So those were the people who New Zealand granted visa for them, and they arrived. And when they were at after the MOQ, they stay in a refugee temporary accommodation. And once the immigration find housing for them, they will move from the temporary accommodation to the house. Some people, the government will send the people to the resettlement centers where they have any friend, family connection. If they don't have any friend, family connection, then they will ask which settlement area they have more like a smaller Afghan community there. They will send them there as well.
And thank you. And there's another question also for Dr. Arif. And it's about how do we find out if there is a refugee or a refugee family in our city, and if they are from the people who left in August? How can we find out?
Thank you. New Zealand Red Cross is has already got the contract for working with Afghan evacuees, but in each city there will be New Zealand Red Cross office, and they can find through them. That is one. Secondly, if there is not a refugee Red Cross there, for example, in Ashburton, I think they have Safer Ashburton, they have there. So they will be notified when this family are sent there. And also the other way that you can find out from, you can ask the resettlement area in your city. For example, in Dunedin, people arriving in also in Christchurch, also Red Cross is working with them. Resettlement, Christchurch Resettlement Service is working with the refugees as well. They will be notified because they will be supporting these families.
Well, and then another question is all about the volunteer for teaching English to Afghan refugees. So it seems like a lot of questions come to Dr. Arif because these are the practical questions. And I would like to also show you at least the history, the quick 2 slides that Dr. Najib Lafraie prepared. So let's just answer this question first. Whom to contact if one wants to volunteer for teaching English to Afghan refugees?
Yep. All of these people will be put in touch with the English language partner or the home tutoring program, all of them, because especially the one who need English. Some of them, they speak perfect English because they are well educated, and also some of them because they work with New Zealand organization in Afghanistan. Their English is perfect. Some of them, they don't. But one is Red Cross, the other one is English language partner. They will be notified because there will be organizations working with this group to connect them with areas of need, employment, education, English language. They will be community connector to connect them to these services. Through these community connectors, you can find as well.
That's great. And if I may, I'd like to, just because we had some technical problems in the beginning, and I think that if you just have a quick look at the history of Afghanistan, it's only 3 slides or so, to put that in the context, and if I can ask Dr. Najib to say a few words about that. Just a moment, I'll see if I can get this going. Here, okay.
Yeah, this shows the top on the right with the red.
I just, yeah, let me see if I can get it big. Yeah.
That shows the strategic location of Afghanistan at the heart of Asia. And bottom right, the neighbors of Afghanistan. The bottom left, there are 33 provinces. So these are different provinces. And as far as the area is concerned, it's about 2.5 times New Zealand size, 652,000 kilometers square, and the capital is Kabul.
Okay, and yes.
Yeah, we've never had reliable census, so this is just an estimate, around 33 to 35 million people. But the important thing is the ethnic groups, because I mentioned the ethnic groups earlier. As you see, Afghanistan is a country of minorities because no ethnic group reaches even 50%, the largest, and these are disputed. So this is, I think this is from CIA sources, which is widely quoted. They gave Pashtuns about 40-42%, Tajiks 27-30%, Hazaras, and those refugees who came earlier, they mostly belong to this ethnic group who live in central Afghanistan, and they are in minority both in ethnic terms and also in religious terms, because the majority of Hazaras are Shia, while the majority of Afghans as a whole are Sunni. The other ethnic groups, a big ethnic group is Uzbeks, and then we have Turkmens and Aymak and Baluch, and I think there are over 30 different ethnic groups. What is interesting that although the Pashtuns are the majority, Farsi is more widely spoken. Why? Because those Pashtuns who moved to the cities, they lost their mother language and they adopted Farsi as their, so this is why Farsi is given. Probably more than 60-70% of Afghans are know Farsi, but is much more widely spoken, and Pashto speaking, I think, is given usually around 35%. And these different ethnic groups, they have also different languages. So again, we have about 30 or so languages, but majority of Afghans are bilingual. They know their own language and they know Farsi and in some cases Pashto. Coming to religion, 99.9% of Afghans are Muslims. And in Islam, as you know, there are two main schools of thought. The Sunnis, they are in majority around the world, about 85% in the world Sunnis, and about 15% Shias in Afghanistan, about 80% of the population Sunnis, and about 20% Shias. Not only Hazaras, but also we have other Shias in Herat and Mazar and other areas.
And this is, yeah.
Yeah,
So yeah.
Go ahead, yeah, please.
This is what I mentioned at the beginning, that we had that the Silk Road, the connection between Asia and Europe. And I just thought it was interesting to have that background and the maps, as we are now talking about the refugees and where they're coming from, and what area they are coming from and what they need when they come to New Zealand.
Yeah, just briefly, Afghanistan has a history of 50 years, because archaeological sites show that there were people living in the area that is called Afghanistan today 50,000 years, but it was not called Afghanistan. It used to be the center of some empires and then parts of some empires. And modern Afghanistan emerged at mid 18th century when Ahmad Shah Durrani, the top on the right, he was an officer at Nadir Afshar army. He decided to establish his own kingdom. And it was not called Afghanistan even then. And it was called Afghanistan thanks to the British, because the British, they started using, it was called Durrani Empire, or when they moved to Kabul, the Kabul Kingdom. And then the British historians and writers started calling it Afghanistan. In the second half of the 19th century, there were two Anglo-Afghan wars, one 1838 to 1842, at the end of which, out of about 20,000 army, most of them Indians, but about 4,000 or 5,000 British, only one person, Dr. Brydon, survived. And from there, the British learned their lesson, and next time when they went to Afghanistan in 1878 to 1880, they decided to bring one of the princes, Abdul Rahman, to power. So he agreed to give conduct of foreign affairs to the British. As you know, this is the time of the Great Game. So British India is afraid of the Russian Empire moving closer to India. So he agreed to give up foreign relations in exchange for British arms and cash. And thanks to the arms and British cash and arms, he was able to establish centralized government. So the so-called nation state could be dated back to Abdul Rahman. And it was his grandson, Amanullah, who came to power in 1919, who won the full independence again. But he wanted to modernize Afghanistan in a very rash way, in a very superficial way, and that faced opposition and a revolt by Abiullah Kalakani at the bottom. He revolted. He was in power only for less than a year. And then another belonging to the same ethnic group, but not from the past royal family, Nadir Shah, he became king. And Zahir Shah that you saw in my first slide, he was Nadir Shah's son. Nadir Shah was killed after 4 years, and his son came to power in 1933 and reigned and ruled for 40 years until 1973.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Najib. And that I always think it's good to have the historic context and to see that Afghanistan has such an amazing background of history and culture. And Dr. Arif Saeid was mentioning the refugees who've been coming and well qualified. They are proud of their country, but they are desperate and have left. And yes, so we wish you all the best, and we wish the refugees all the best. And thank you very much, Dr. Najib Lafraie and Dr. Arif Saeid. And it has been really enlightening. And I think that if anybody would like to get in touch with Dr. Arif Saeid regarding the refugees, if you contact Pearl of Ireland Foundation, I'm sure that Zahib will forward the contacts. And because many of the questions that we've had now were regarding practical help, so there is the way, and Zahib will put you in touch. And I thought finishing this webinar about a country that has suffered so much and about people having come to New Zealand, I thought we could close with one of the verses of the New Zealand national anthem. And I won't sing it, I'll spare you that, but I will read that verse that I find really, really important. And it's a symbol for all of us for living together in harmony. And it goes, Ona mano tangata, kiri whero kiri ma, iwi Māori I Pākehā, rupe ke katoa, nei katono ko ngahe, mau e whakahau ke kia ora marie Aotearoa. Men of every creed and race, gather here before thy face, asking thee to bless this place. God defend our free land. From dissension, envy, hate, corruption, and guard our state. Make our country good and great. God defend New Zealand. Thank you very much.
And Afghanistan too.
And Afghanistan too. Correct. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And sorry we couldn't reply to the questions or all the noise messages or the audience put on. Thanks for all your noise messages you put there. And I could not at the same time type to reply to you, but thank you for the good messages, noise messages.
Thank you. Yes, so as I said, you can stay in touch, get in touch with Zahib at the Pearl of Ireland Foundation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.